Hello, and welcome to the Houstonic Museum of Art. Today we are going to take a virtual walk through the current exhibition of Woman Born. There is nothing revolutionary whatsoever about the control of women's bodies by men, to quote author, poet, and feminist Adrienne Rich. The woman's body is the terrain on which patriarchy is erected. Of Woman Born explores the ways in which male dominance has manifested itself in familial, social, legal, political, religious, and economic systems. Patriarchal structures that, over the centuries, have continually been used to dominate, oppress, and exploit women. Although women have made great strides, such as the right to vote and equal access to education, there is still more work to be done. Women's rights are human rights and include freedom from discrimination, freedom from violence, and freedom from gender inequality. The nudes of ancient Greece and Rome came to influence later Western art and to define what was considered beautiful. The values and ideals of the Greco-Roman culture were characterized by perfection in form, unity, harmony, and symmetry. Art historian Kenneth Clark considered idealization to be the hallmark of true nudes, as opposed to more descriptive and less artful figures that he considered merely naked. His emphasis on idealization points to an essential issue. Seductive and appealing as nudes in art may be, they are meant to stir the mind as well as the passions. The Three Graces seen here is a reproduction of one of the most famous neoclassical masterpieces by the renowned Italian sculptor Antonio Canova. Inspired by the sculptures of ancient Greece and Rome, he revived their aesthetic ideals of symmetry, proportion, and balance of form. This work depicts the daughters of Zeus from left to right, Euphrosyne, Agalaia, and Thalia, who represent radiance, joy, and youth and beauty respectively. These goddesses of nature form the original mythology of the early Greeks and, over time, evolved into the Three Graces. As companions of Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, they confer beauty and enjoyment in all its forms, from physical to intellectual to artistic and moral, and as attendants to the Muses, they are associated with the most perfect works of art. Regarded as the greatest German Renaissance artist, Albrecht Dürer's immense body of work includes altarpieces and religious works, numerous portraits and self-portraits, and engravings. Here we see his depiction of 4 nude females along with a skull and long bone on the floor of the chamber, while Satan peers through an opening, surreptitiously observing them. Like Canova, Dürer may have been inspired by the famous sculpture The Three Graces, adopting the composition but instead depicting the Greek goddess Hecate, guardian of the household and patroness of witchcraft. Often represented with 3 faces or bodies, it suggests that she is able to see into the future, the past, and the present. Once revered as a virgin goddess, Hecate eschewed marriage, valuing her solitude and independence, and over time was transformed into a wizened hag or witch. Perhaps this subject appealed to Dürer when, in 15th century Germany, women were singled out as witches for the first time in history. Witch hunts swept across the Holy Roman Empire from 1435 to 1750, fueled by the publication of the manual Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, in 1487, inciting mass hysteria in Germany and across Europe. Authored by the priest Heinrich Kramer, the text was so flawed that the Catholic Church rejected it, stating it did not reflect its teachings. Nevertheless, the publication soon gained in popularity, providing methods for identifying witches, as well as providing the biblical and legal grounds for persecution. The Protestant Reformation of 1517 sparked a religious war with the Holy Roman Empire, resulting in tens of thousands of victims who were tried, tortured, and executed, 3/4 of whom were women, resulting in what can rightly be called gendercide. Patriarchy, from the ancient Greek patriarchs, is a society where power and privilege are wielded by one gender, male. The human construct of absolute authority over women is reinforced through religious myths that illustrate that female subservience to man is a God-given condition and of her own making. The Greek writer Hesiod offers an account of the origin of the world in his poem Theogony, informing us that Zeus created the first woman in order to torment men. She is described as a beautiful evil and a deception which men cannot manage. From her come generations of women, a great pain for mortal men on earth, an evil for mortals, companions in harsh suffering. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, in Politics, continues this line of reasoning when he asserts that perfection in spirit and form are realized in the male body, while women are conceived by defective seed. Women, he thought, were foolish, mentally weak, unintelligent, and captive to their passions. Greek texts and thought appear to be reflected in the biblical story of the fall of man that similarly places the blame for all human suffering squarely at the feet of the first woman, Eve. At the moment God creates her from Adam's rib, Eve is positioned as less than, inferior, the second sex as it were, perennially justifying her subordinate role within both marriage and society. The notion that Eve is deficient and imperfect, incapable of knowing right from wrong, and easily led astray is revealed by her encounter with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Disobeying God's commandment to eat from any tree except the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, both Adam and Eve incur his wrath. To the woman God said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to Adam God said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Eve's enduring reputation as a temptress and thus a treacherous woman ensures her everlasting purpose as a symbol of women's long struggle to overcome patriarchal ideology as expressed through its social, sexual, religious, political, and economic power structures. At the dawn of religion, God was a woman, according to sculptor and art historian Merlin Stone. Fetish objects dating from the Upper Paleolithic era through the Neolithic period were symbols of fertility that emphasized female attributes, breasts and buttocks, and were carried as a totem or worshipped as a mother goddess, the creator and sustainer of life. Proto-Indo-European invaders, it is theorized, supplanted these matriarchal and more egalitarian societies with patriarchal religions and laws. After the Neolithic Revolution, when humans transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherers to farming settlements, more complex beliefs, rituals, and cult worship emerged. In Egypt, the goddess Isis, seen here, was often represented as a beautiful woman wearing a sheath dress, seated on a throne, and wearing a solar disk and cow horns on her head. She had limitless powers, separating the heavens from earth, healing the sick, and resurrecting the dead. Eventually, her attributes and abilities were absorbed into both Greek and Roman mythologies. In Italy, by the end of the 2nd BCE, Isis was worshipped as a supreme goddess revered for her omnipotence. She was light and dark, night and day, fire and water, life and death, beginning and end. Throughout the Holy Roman Empire, which stretched from England to Egypt, Isis was championed as a symbol of equality between the sexes, conferring to women as much authority and respect as that held by men. Although paganism was eventually banned in Rome through laws and persecution, Isis remained too popular to suppress. Eventually, Christians incorporated the attributes belonging to Isis, suffering, mercy, and protection, into Mother Mary, along with the traditional Roman ideals of virginity, devotion, and marriage. The concept of death and resurrection had long been established through the myth of Osiris, murdered husband of Isis, and was now made manifest in the figure of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In time, epithets reserved for Isis, such as Mother of God and Queen of Heaven, were also ascribed to the Virgin Mary. The image of Isis nursing her miraculously conceived child god, Horus, likely inspired the conventional Christian iconography of the Madonna with Christ child, as seen here. From the Paleolithic age through to the Neolithic era, infanticide was widely practiced, with anthropologists estimating that anywhere from 15 to 50% of newborns were killed to limit the population. A nomadic lifestyle meant that women could not manage, feed, or travel with several small children at once. After the agricultural revolution, women's lives were more rooted, with food supplies steady and more predictable, which led to the Neolithic baby boom, where children were necessary, eventually providing much-needed labor. Motherhood was the primary occupation of Greco-Roman women, regardless of their social class. Children produced in these marriages were the property of the father, with male children valued above female children. These warrior cultures required future soldiers to maintain the empire, and in Greece, generally one female child per family was often all that was needed. Frail, sickly, or deformed male babies, as well as unwelcome female newborns, were abandoned and often succumbed to exposure unless they were adopted into brothels or sold into slavery. In Rome, newborns were placed in clay pots and left outside the home to either suffocate, starve, or be collected and sold. During the Greco-Roman period, Egyptians, whose culture forbade infanticide and valued both sexes equally, rescued these babies and kept them as household slaves. From the 15th century onward, the work of nursing and caring for the newborns of the wealthy fell to working-class women. This practice of placing babies with nurses would soon be adopted by the lower classes when in 1834 England enacted the New Poor Laws. These new rulings included the bastardy clause that barred unwed mothers and their illegitimate children from receiving public assistance. Under this new system, men were no longer required to marry the mothers of their children or to provide financial support. These fallen women were often turned out of their family homes and, if they were lucky enough to find work, were immediately discharged as soon as their condition became obvious. The shame and sin, as well as the cost to support herself and her child, were borne by the woman alone. For these stigmatized women, leaving their children in the care of foster mothers was often the only option. This practice, called baby farming, was a euphemism for infanticide, an industry that delivered desperate mothers from a life of misery. Maternity is both a biological state and a cultural construct, and consequently the ideas and expectations surrounding it are often naturalized, making the politics involved in this social role obscure. Feminist poet Adrienne Rich points out the hypocrisy underpinning the notion of absolute respect for human life. She says, "Women know firsthand about the violence of the warrior and the institutional violence of political and social systems in which we have little part, but which affects our bodies and our children. The violence over which we have been told is the way of the world." A woman's place is in the home, a well-worn phrase that can be traced back to the Greek playwright Aeschylus in 467 BCE, was popularized in 19th century books, church sermons, and magazines like Godey's Lady's Book and Lady's Companion that espouse the Victorian ideals of the cult of domesticity. The angel in the house was the embodiment of purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity, a set of beliefs that essentially confined a woman to the private sphere of home and hearth. The true woman, as she was also called, was charged with the care of the home, overseeing the formal and religious education of the children, and above all provided a haven for her harried husband from the rough and tumble world. Upper and middle class women were not permitted to work outside the home, according to historian Barbara Welter, as they were seen as too delicate of mind and body to withstand the demands of the public sphere. The high-status female, barred from the labor market, also communicated to Victorian society that her husband was successful and wealthy, thus able to keep her. Of course, these privileges did not extend to the working class, poor, or women of color who, without a private income or a man, were not only employed outside the home, but were seen by Victorian society as immoral, unworthy, and contemptible. Although the cult of domesticity restricted women's options for work, for education, and participation in the arenas of politics, business, and public service, it nevertheless provided women with the leisure time to network, organize, and advocate for reform from within the home. Wealthy, well-educated, and well-connected women like Catherine Beecher, who spearheaded the first protest led by women against the Indian Removal Act, and her sister Harriet Beecher Stowe, a world-renowned author who used her notoriety and influence to advocate on behalf of the anti-slavery movement, are such examples. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the writers and philosophers Mary Wollstonecraft, Frances Wright, and Harriet Martineau were criticized by clergy and the press for advocating for women's rights and calling for social equality, which was seen as undermining the feminine virtues of passivity and submission promoted by the cult of domesticity. After voting rights were expanded to include almost all white males between 1812 to 1850, many women took encouragement believing that they too might win the right to vote. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention held in New York, which was the first women's rights movement focusing on women's suffrage, political activism, and legal independence. Modeled on the Declaration of Independence, Stanton read from her own document, the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." On that July day, Stanton's call to action sparked the beginning of the fight for equal rights for women in America. The women's movement included a decades-long fight for the right to vote that began in the mid-19th century. The Seneca Falls Convention in July of 1848 brought together 200 women and 40 men, including feminists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, to fight for the right to vote. The delegates believed women to be full citizens and not restricted to their roles as wives or mothers. The claustrophobia of the cult of domesticity gave way to activism when intrepid, outspoken women campaigned to reform societal ills as diverse as prostitution, alcohol, and, most significantly, slavery. Feminist artist Suzanne Benton of Ridgefield dedicated herself to researching and documenting influential suffragettes in her print series, Votes for Women. This print of Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who graduated Oberlin College in Ohio in 1847, was the first female ordained Protestant minister in the United States. Blackwell joined the women's rights movement, giving her first speech at the 1850 National Women's Rights Convention. Also active in the abolitionist and temperance movements, she wrote for Frederick Douglass's newspaper, The North Star. In 1873, Blackwell founded the Association for the Advancement of Women, and in 1920, at age 95, she witnessed the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. This print features Florence Hope Luscombe, one of the first women to graduate MIT and receive her degree in architecture in 1909. Born in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1887, Luscombe's mother, Hannah Knox Luscombe, was a feminist and active in the women's suffrage movement. When she was only 5, her mother brought her to hear Susan B. Anthony, the social reformer and women's rights activist, speak, igniting within her a lifelong passion for advocacy work. After 9 years as an architect, Luscombe left the field to work full-time on behalf of the Boston Equal Suffrage Association. And while women's history remembers the names of Blackwell and Luscombe, let us not forget the countless extraordinary women, black and white, whose contributions remain anonymous. In Nicholas Africano's painting Ironing Board Battered Women series from 1978, we see a woman ironing her shirt as she prepares to face the day. As we look more closely at the tiny, isolated figure floating in a sea of pink, we spot bruises on her face and back. The notion of home as a safe haven is upended. Instead, it becomes a private space in which to exercise gender-based violence. In 1994, the Violence Against Women Act, a landmark piece of legislation designed to support and protect survivors of domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault, was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. Issues such as domestic abuse moved out of the familial private sphere to become a community issue. In 2019, the reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act passed the House of Representatives before stopping at the Republican-controlled Senate. Although Congress has continued to provide funding grants for programs to address domestic violence, and the Office of Violence Against Women remains active in the U.S. Justice Department, the future of safety and equality for women once again hangs in the balance. Abortion has been practiced since ancient times, including techniques such as binding, use of abortifacients, and of course, the use of instruments. The Egyptian Ebers papyrus, dated 1550 BCE, offers the first written documentation of an induced abortion. In ancient Greece and Rome, it is hard to imagine that a culture that practiced infanticide would outlaw abortion, but there was one exception. A wife was obligated to carry a child to term if her husband died, in order that the male child could inherit his estate. For most of history, women were able to terminate a pregnancy prior to the moment of quickening, that is, when she could feel the movement of her child. In colonial America, the same laws existed for both married and unmarried women, allowing them to determine when, if, and how many children to bear. By the 19th century, as Victorian women began to limit the number of children they bore, waves of immigrants began arriving on the shores of America, threatening the status quo of the ruling class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. The response to family planning was swift, according to Carol Smith Rosenberg in her book Disorderly Conduct: Visions of Gender in Victorian America, with the Victorian anti-abortion movement portraying women who terminated their pregnancies as unnatural and selfish, undermining the expected, patriotic, and godly role of the American woman, that of wife and mother. By the 1960s, during the civil rights and women's liberation movement, women once again sought to manage their own bodies. In 1973, the Supreme Court handed down the landmark decision of Roe v. Wade, stating that abortion is a woman's constitutional right, along with control of her own reproductive health. 48 years later, as the white population recedes in number, efforts to overturn Roe v. Wade are gaining momentum through Republican-controlled state legislatures that are seeking to restrict access to abortion clinics or to ban it altogether. Erotica is a genre of art that spans thousands of years and can be found across many cultures. For women in the Victorian age, domestic purity and feminine virtue were the ideals that informed true womanhood, with sex strictly reserved for procreation. Yet for all their rigid morality codes and high-minded principles, the literature and theater of the day revealed their obsession with sex. In 1839, the invention of photography was quickly put to use, creating illicit images for both the hetero and homosexual underground market that catered to the upper and lower classes alike. Lynn Augeri's photographic self-portraits take the genre of Victorian daguerreotypes as inspiration, blurring the line between the artistic and the pornographic, so Augeri's self-portraits occupy an ambiguous zone, according to art critic John Howell, between positive sexual bravado and perverse exhibitionism, confidently laying out the contradiction between the two. She employs the visual rhetoric of both the erotic and the pornographic and toys with the traditions of artistic conventions that inform the viewer as to what is and what isn't an acceptable image. These visual cues, however, are mutable as social mores change across time, and what was once unacceptable becomes mainstream. Augeri's photographs deal specifically with sexist representations of women in art and in popular culture, to reveal what art historian Abigail Solomon Godeau calls the systemic quality of objectification and fetishism in the representation of women, to show the complex network of relations that meshes power, patriarchy, and representation. In Aidan Boyle's print, Be the Ideal, we see an average-looking mother and daughter smiling for the camera against a billboard backdrop featuring a young, hypersexualized, ultra-thin model, completely nude but for the shoes and a strategically placed handbag. Advertising images like this one have co-opted the conventions of pornography, a practice that is referred to by several different labels, including pornographication, porno chic, and pornification. The commodification of the female body performs a normative role culturally and socially as women are sold the aesthetics of porno chic, integrating style elements into their everyday presentation of themselves. Fashion designers like Tom Ford claim that these images are empowering. However, they may simply be the latest iteration of the objectification of women. The media habitually depicts a narrow and often unattainable standard of an ideal physical beauty and links this standard to women's own attractiveness and value. Repeated exposure to messages that equate beauty and appearance with a female self-worth leads to the internalization of impossible cultural standards of beauty, which in turn may lead to body dissatisfaction, social anxiety, depression, and eating disorders, especially in adolescence. In this work, Achieve Perfection Through Dissection, the artist has employed an advertising technique that uses a fragmented female face presented as a collection of problematic parts in search of a solution, while the accompanying text reinforces the same message. Perfection can be procured through cosmetics or cosmetic surgery. Boyle's artwork invites us to examine a media environment that continually objectifies the female body, to question traditional gender norms, and to think critically about the relationship between representation and power. Using herself as a model, Westport artist Sherry Wolfgang is marked and mapped for a plethora of surgical procedures to tighten and tweak her body and face. Enslaved to the male gaze, a term coined by feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey in her seminal 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, women are often viewed as objects of male desire. Our culture's emphasis on a woman's beauty supersedes all her other attributes, credentials, and accomplishments. Wolfgang illustrates for the viewer the extreme measures that women will take to slow the aging process in an effort to preserve their status, worth, and security. The Old Bags project began in 2011 as a collaboration between two older Fairfield artists in response to a consumer culture that privileges youth. Co-opting the term old bag, a phrase often used to diminish an aging woman's value, they invited older women to participate in this portrait project, which has had a variety of iterations, including photographs, as seen here, video and audio installations, outdoor projections, and a book. Having understood advertising's messages that growing old is not only unacceptable, it's offensive, Petchers and Baum ask us to examine the ways in which advertising coerces women to participate in and internalize the pressure to be forever 21. I hope you enjoyed your tour of the exhibit of Woman Born, and I'd like to invite you to visit the campus. We will be reopening September 2nd with a new exhibition of works by John Schuler, and the current exhibition of Woman Born will remain on view through June 2022. For further information, please visit our website, www.houstonicmuseum.org. Thank you again.